White rose petals swirled in the air like snowflakes as they dropped to the emerald lawn of the Kane estate. Alice Ford, now Alice Kane, was radiant in her ivory lace dress. Her eyes, bright blue, radiated happiness as she accepted congratulations from her guests. James Kane, her husband of 2 hours, had not taken a step away from her, holding her hand as if he was afraid she would disappear. Robert Kane watched the newlyweds from the side, sipping whiskey from a crystal glass. His eyes, exactly the same blue as his son's, expressed something between pride and predatory interest. The 55-year-old businessman looked impeccable in a dark gray tailored suit with a scarlet flower in his buttonhole. "To the lovely couple," he proclaimed, raising his glass. "To my son James and his lovely bride Alice." The guests applauded. Alice smiled, but her smile faltered when she met her father-in-law's gaze. Something in his eyes made her inwardly shudder. "Alice, darling," Robert walked over to her as James was distracted by one of the guests. "I have an important financial matter to discuss with you. Could you give me 5 minutes in my office?" "Right now?" She frowned. "But the guests aren't going anywhere." Robert's smile didn't touch his eyes. "This is really important, Alice. It's about your future." Alice nodded and, glancing at James, who was engrossed in conversation with his university friends, followed Robert. They crossed the main hall, climbed the spiral staircase, and entered a spacious study with dark oak paneling and floor-to-ceiling bookcases. On the wall hung an antique hunting rifle that Alice knew Robert was very proud of. "Sit down." He pointed to a leather armchair, then settled himself at the massive desk and pulled out a folder. "Do you know what this is?" Alice went cold, recognizing the bank logo on the folder. $280,000 in credit, Robert said, flipping through the pages. "In the name of Alice Ford. Borrowed at a monstrous interest rate for one Brian Donovan. Your ex, I presume?" "Where did you get this?" Her voice was barely audible. "It doesn't matter." Robert waved it away. "What matters is that James doesn't know about it, and my son, as you know, is extremely sensitive about financial matters. Pathologically scrupulous, I'd say." Alice swallowed, clutching the lacy fabric of the dress in her hands. "What do you want? Do you realize that the first paycheck from the bank and the marriage is over?" Robert leaned back in his chair. James would never forgive such deception, especially on the first day of marriage. He stood up and walked over to the bar, poured himself another whiskey and continued, "But I can help. Right now I can transfer $280,000 to your account. It's a huge sum. You could buy a big house with it." "Why do you want to help me?" Alice asked, though in her heart she already knew the answer. Robert walked around the table and stood directly in front of her, leaning on the countertop. His eyes roamed her body without any hesitation. "One favor for another," he said quietly. "You give me one favor and I'll pay off all your loans. No one will ever know." Alice felt nausea coming up her throat. "You're disgusting. You're James's father." "Think carefully, Alice. $280,000 for 15 minutes of your time. The best deal of your life." The music and laughter of the guests came from downstairs, a reminder that her husband and all their friends were only a few dozen feet away, but here in this office she was trapped. 15 minutes, Robert repeated, pulling out his cell phone. "And I'll do the transfer right in front of you." Alice closed her eyes. 280,000, freedom from debt, a chance to start a family without that sword of Damocles hanging over her head. "Okay," she whispered. "Do the transfer first." Robert smiled, and keeping his eyes on her, began manipulating the banking application. "Here," he turned the screen toward her. "The transfer is complete. You can check your account." Alice pulled out her phone, opened the bank app, and saw an incoming transfer for $280,000. She felt dizzy. "Your turn," Robert said, unbuckling his belt. 20 minutes later, Alice stared at Robert Kane's body stretched out in the chair. Blood from a gunshot wound in his chest soaked his snow-white shirt. An antique hunting rifle, still warm from the shot, lay at her feet. She quickly tore the shoulder of her dress, ruffled her hair, and took a deep breath. Then she walked to the study door, swung it open, and began to scream. "Help! Help! He's attacking me!" Her screams instantly attracted the attention of the guests and staff. A security guard was the first to arrive, followed by several guests. They saw Alice with a torn dress, in tears, and Robert Kane's body in a chair with a gunshot wound in his chest. "He made me!" screamed Alice, pointing a trembling hand at the body. "And then he became aggressive. I was defending myself!" "Call the police!" yelled the guard, checking Robert's pulse. "He's dead!" James Kane, hearing the screams, rushed upstairs. Seeing Alice in tears and his father's body, he froze with shock. "Alice! Oh my God! What happened?" "James!" She rushed to him, sobbing. "He's your father! He forced himself on me, and then—" Less than an hour later, Robert Kane's office was filled with police officers. Detective Martha Reed, a 42-year-old woman with short brown hair and piercing brown eyes, was leading the investigation. She scrutinized the body and the scene, giving orders to the technicians. "Time of death?" she asked the medical examiner. "Preliminarily between 6 o'clock and 7 p.m. about 2 hours ago." Martha nodded, making notes in her notebook. Her attention was drawn to Robert's cell phone lying on the table. She put on her gloves and picked it up. The screen was not locked. "Bank transfer," she noted, looking at the latest transactions. $280,000 to Alice Ford's account. Transfer time is 6 hours and 45 minutes past midnight. "Detective," one of the technicians called out, "take a look at this." He pointed to the victim's groin area, where traces of bright red lipstick were clearly visible. "Intimate contact before death," Martha stated. "Take pictures and samples." She left the office and went down to the living room where Alice was sitting, surrounded by police officers. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, her makeup smeared with tears. She looked completely devastated by what had happened. "Mrs. Kane," Martha walked over and introduced herself. "I'm Detective Reed. I need to ask you some questions." Alice looked up at her, her eyes full of tears. "I know this is hard for you," Martha continued, sitting down next to her. "But the sooner we get to the bottom of this, the better. Tell me what happened in Mr. Kane's office." "He invited me to discuss the wedding present," Alice began quietly, her voice trembling. "He said he wanted to help James and me. He wired me money, a lot of money, and then—" Her voice trailed off. "What happened after the transfer?" Martha asked gently. "He changed, became different. Said I should thank him now. When I refused, he tore my dress, became aggressive. He made me." Alice couldn't continue, bursting into tears again. "Are you saying that he forced you to have intimate contact?" Martha clarified. Alice nodded silently without raising her eyes. "And then?" "When it was over, he said it was our secret, and that I belonged to him now. I was terrified, grabbed the gun off the wall, just to scare him. But he jumped on me. We fought over the gun, and it went off." Martha watched the expression on Alice's face carefully. In her 15 years as a police officer, she had learned to notice small details that could indicate a lie. There was fear in Alice's eyes, but there was something else in them too. "I noticed that the amount of the transfer was $280,000. Why that amount?" Alice hesitated for a second. "It's, for the down payment on the house. Robert knew that James and I were looking for a place to live." "I see," Martha made another note. "Mrs. Kane, I'm going to need you to get a medical exam and submit samples for analysis. It's standard procedure in cases like this." "Of course," Alice nodded. "I understand." Martha returned to the office where the technicians were finishing collecting evidence. She took another close look at the body, the gun, and the surroundings. Alice's story sounded plausible, but something was bothering the detective. She went to the window and looked out over the estate's night garden. The wedding reception had turned into a crime scene. The guests who had recently congratulated the happy couple were now giving statements to the police. Martha fidgeted with her notebook. The money transfer, the intimate contact, the gunshot. It all added up to a coherent picture. But was that picture complete? Or was there something darker lurking behind the apparent story of self-defense? James Kane approached her, his face pale with shock and grief. "Detective, what's going on? My wife says her father attacked her, but I can't believe it." "Mr. Kane, we're investigating and will determine the truth," Martha replied. "In the meantime, you'd better support your wife. She's in a serious condition." James nodded, but there was doubt in his eyes. "I knew my father. He could be tough, even ruthless in business, but violence, that wasn't like him. People aren't always what we think they are, Martha said, especially the ones we love. She glanced at Robert Kane's cell phone again, at the confirmation of the transfer, $280,000, a huge sum for a wedding gift. And why that particular figure? Mr. Kane, did your father tell you of his intention to give such a generous wedding gift? James looked surprised. No, he hadn't said anything. What kind of gift? A transfer of $280,000 to your wife's account. He made it shortly before he died. James frowned. $280,000? No, that's odd. My father never mentioned such a gift. He was against me marrying Alice at all. He didn't think she was... He hesitated. Suitable for me. Martha made a note in her notebook. Another inconsistency in Alice's story. At that moment, one of the technicians approached her. Detective, the body examination is complete. We're ready for transportation to the morgue. Good, Martha nodded. I want a full report as soon as possible. She took another look around the office. There were traces of whiskey on the desk and a scrap of white cloth torn from a dress on the floor. Martha picked it up and examined it closely. The fabric had been torn very smoothly, as if it had been carefully cut rather than torn in the struggle. Her gaze fell on the shotgun, already packed away as evidence. Antique, but in excellent condition. It required not just pulling the trigger to fire, but first pulling the trigger, an action that required intent. Outside the window, the sky was slowly brightening. Dawn was coming, but for the Kane family, the day would bring nothing but grief and new questions. And for Martha Reed, it was the beginning of a complex investigation that she sensed would be full of surprises. As she left the Kane estate, Martha cast one last glance at Alice, who was sitting with her arms around James, saying something quietly to him. There was a look of grief on her face, but when she looked up and met the detective's eyes, Martha saw for a moment not pain, but cold calculation. The morning sun cast a soft golden light into the interview room of the Riverview police station, creating a deceptively cozy atmosphere. Alice Kane, still in her wedding dress, though not as white and spotless as yesterday, sat at the desk across from Detective Martha Reed. Her hands, folded in her lap, trembled slightly. Mrs. Kane, let's go over the events of last night one more time, Martha said calmly, turning on the tape recorder. The more accurate your testimony, the sooner we can close this case. Alice swallowed, nervously adjusting a strand of hair out of her once elegant style. I've told you before. Robert had invited me into his office, ostensibly to discuss a wedding gift. When we were alone, he showed me my old credit cards. Said he'd tell James if I didn't give in to him. You mean he blackmailed you into intimacy in exchange for silence? Martha clarified. Yes, Alice's voice trembled. He knew James was obsessed with financial purity. To him, a hidden debt was a betrayal, especially one so large. $280,000, Martha nodded. That's the amount Robert transferred into your account shortly before he died. Why? Alice hesitated for a moment, as if searching for words. He made the transfer and said it would be our wedding present, that he'd been meaning to help James and me start a family for a long time. As if this had been his plan all along, not blackmail. And then, after the money was transferred, he forced himself on me. Alice lowered her eyes. When it was over, he got aggressive, said he owned me now. He tore my dress, pushed me. I got scared and grabbed the gun off the wall just to defend myself. We struggled, and it went off. Martha watched Alice's face carefully. Over the years, she had learned to spot the small signs of lying, avoiding a direct look, unnecessary details in a story, inconsistencies in the sequence of events. Alice was convincing, but something about her story didn't add up. Correct me if I'm wrong, Martha said, reviewing her notes. Robert first blackmails you by threatening to tell your husband about the debts. Then he transfers you the exact amount of those debts, forces intimacy, gets aggressive, and you defend yourself. Is that right? Yes, that's right, Alice nodded. If he'd already transferred the money, why would he get aggressive? Wasn't it in his best interest to keep it a secret? Alice licked her lips nervously. He was drunk, and I think power, it's more intoxicating than alcohol. He got what he wanted, and that made him even hotter. Martha made a note in her notebook. The explanation sounded plausible, but it didn't explain all the inconsistencies. At that moment, a young officer entered the room and handed Martha a folder. She quickly glanced through the contents, the results of the preliminary examination of the body and the forensics report. The lipstick marks of an intimate nature support your story of sexual contact, Martha said, closing the folder. But there were no signs of a struggle on the gun, only your fingerprints on the trigger and barrel. I was in a panic, Alice said quickly. Maybe I remembered the details wrong. It all happened so fast. In another room at the police station, James Kane was giving a statement to Officer Thompson. His face was pale from a sleepless night and shock. My father was always an overbearing man, he said, staring at one point. He was used to getting what he wanted at any cost. But I never thought he was capable of... James couldn't bring himself to say it out loud. What has your relationship been like lately? The officer asked. Tense, James admitted. He was against my marrying Alice. He said she wasn't right for me, that she was after my money. We had a big fight about it a month before the wedding. We've barely spoken since. But he came to the wedding. Yeah, James grinned bitterly. Robert Kane would never miss an opportunity to appear in public, even if he was internally opposed to it. The image of the perfect family was more important to him than the actual relationship. Detective Reed met with the medical examiner, Dr. Harris, in the precinct commander's office. What do we got, Doc? She asked. Death was a single gunshot to the chest at close range, Harris reported. Time of death between 6 o'clock and 7 p.m. Blood alcohol is confirmed, but I wouldn't say he was very drunk. Signs of intimate contact are obvious. However, he paused, there's no sign of a struggle. No scratches or bruises that one would expect if he had actually attacked a woman. What about the victim's torn dress? Analysis of the fabric shows that the tear was not caused by a sudden jerk, as in an assault. Rather, the fabric was carefully cut and then torn. Martha tapped her pencil thoughtfully on the table. So we have a situation where all the physical evidence contradicts the self-defense version, but we have a motive for blackmail on the part of the victim, confirmed by a wire transfer. Exactly. Harris nodded. It's a classic case of things not being as clear-cut as they first appear. Returning to her questioning of Alice, Martha decided to change tactics. Tell me about your loans, Mrs. Kane. $280,000 is a huge sum. What was it spent on? Alice was visibly tense. It's a long story. My ex-boyfriend, Brian Donovan, convinced me to take out loans for his business project. Promised he'd pay me back in a couple months with interest. But then he just disappeared, and I was left with the debt. And you decided to keep that from James? Yes, Alice lowered her eyes. I was afraid he wouldn't understand. James is very principled about finances. He believes that relationships should be based on complete honesty, especially in financial matters. How did Robert find out about your debts? I have no idea. Alice shook her head. He said he'd done some checking. Apparently, it was important for him to know everything about the man his son was marrying. Martha made a few more notes in her notebook. Alice's story was getting more and more complicated. Meanwhile, in Robert Kane's office, which had been turned into a crime scene, the forensic technicians continued to collect evidence. One of them, a young technician named Ryan, found a folder labeled EF Finance in a desk drawer. Detective Reed? He radioed Martha. We found Alice Ford's file in the victim's desk. It's all here. Bank statements, credit history, copies of contracts. Looks like he did some serious investigating. Great, Martha said. Bag everything as evidence and bring it to the station. When the folder arrived, Martha scrutinized its contents. Robert Kane had indeed compiled a detailed dossier on his son's fiancée. Every loan, every payment, everything was neatly documented with notes and comments in the margins. Classic case of financial deception, one of the notes read. Jay must not know, read another. Martha returned to Alice's interrogation with more questions. I have reviewed the documents from Robert Kane's office, she said. He kept detailed records of your financial problems. According to his records, you've already missed loan payments twice. Alice turned pale. Yep, tried to cope. Worked 2 jobs, saved as much as I could, but the interest was too high. And then a generous father-in-law shows up with an offer you can't refuse. Martha said thoughtfully. I didn't want to, Alice said suddenly and loudly. Do you think I planned it? He cornered me, threatened to ruin my marriage on my wedding day. Her emotional outburst seemed genuine, but Martha wasn't sure what to believe anymore. In the next room, James had finished his testimony and sat with his arms around his head. Officer Thompson brought him coffee. How's she doing? James asked. Was Alice okay? Detective Reed is still talking to her, the officer replied. Mr. Kane, were you aware of your wife's financial problems? James looked up at him, puzzled. What kind of problems? $280,000 in loans. James looked stunned. No, she never. I didn't know. That's impossible. We discussed our finances before we got married. She said she had no debt. It sounds like she kept that from you, the officer said softly. And your father found out about it. James sat there, trying to make sense of the new information. His world was crumbling by the minute. $280,000, he muttered. That was the amount his father had transferred to her before he died. Yes, Thompson confirmed. The bank statement showed that the transfer had been made 20 minutes before the time of death. James stood up, his face contorted by the sudden realization. I want to see Alice. I want to see Alice now. I'm afraid that's not possible while the interrogation is in progress. The officer tried to stop him. But James had already jumped out into the corridor and was running toward the interrogation room. He opened the door without knocking, taking Martha and Alice by surprise. James! Alice jumped up, her face brightening at the sight of her husband. Thank God you're here. But the look on James's face stopped her. He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. $280,000, he said quietly. Have you been lying to me all this time, Alice? James, please let me explain. She took a step toward him, but he backed away. Mr. Kane, Martha intervened. You're interrupting a formal interrogation. I have a right to know what happened to my father, his voice trembled, and why my wife kept debts the size of a small house from me. I was afraid of losing you, Alice exclaimed. You always said how important financial honesty was to you. I knew you wouldn't forgive me for lying to you like that. And that's why you kept lying? James asked bitterly. Even after we exchanged vows? Your father gave me no choice. Tears glistened in Alice's eyes. He cornered me, blackmailed me, forced me, and then he got violent. I was just defending myself. James stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to see the truth behind her tears and emotions. I don't know who to believe, he said finally. My father was a complicated man, capable of many things for control. But you, Alice, I don't even know who you really are. He turned and left the room, leaving Alice sobbing by the table. Martha gave her a moment to gather her thoughts, then continued her questioning. Mrs. Kane, let's go back to the moment of the gunshot. You say you grabbed the gun in self-defense, and during the struggle it went off. Is that correct? Yes. Alice wiped away her tears. It all happened so fast. I don't even remember exactly how. The problem, Martha interrupted her, is that the ballistics test shows that the shot was fired from a distance of about 1.5 meters. There was no struggle for the gun. Alice froze, her eyes widening. I don't remember exactly. Maybe he backed off when he saw me take the gun? I was in such a state. Another oddity, Martha continued. There were no signs of struggle on Robert Kane's body, no scratches, no bruises. If he attacked you, why was there no sign of resistance? I don't know. Alice's voice trembled. Maybe I didn't fight back hard enough. I was in shock, scared. Martha tapped her pencil thoughtfully on the table. Alice's story contained too many inconsistencies, but she had no direct evidence of premeditated murder. Let's go over the timeline again, she said. At 6 hours and 45 minutes, Robert Kane transfers $280,000 to you. After that, there is sexual contact. Then, according to you, he becomes aggressive. You defend yourself. A gunshot is fired, all of this in about 20 minutes. Yeah, Alice nodded. It all happened very quickly. And you claim that the transfer was a wedding present, which Robert supposedly talked about a long time ago. but James just said he didn't know anything about it. And from what I understand, Robert was against your marriage. Alice looked cornered. He wanted it to be a surprise. He didn't even tell James. A surprise in the form of the exact amount of your loans? Martha raised an eyebrow. That's too much of a coincidence, don't you think? I don't know what else to tell you. Alice lowered her head. I'm telling you the truth. He blackmailed me, coerced me, and then he got violent. I defended myself. Martha closed the notebook. She had plenty of suspicions, but not enough evidence to charge Alice with premeditated murder. That's all for now, Mrs. Kane, she said. But don't leave town. The investigation is ongoing. Alice stood up, her legs trembling slightly. What now? She asked quietly. Can I go home now? Yes, Martha nodded. An officer will escort you, but again, do not leave the city. After Alice left, Martha sat in the empty interrogation room for a long time, reviewing her notes. Every detail indicated that the self-defense theory was just a cleverly constructed lie, but without direct evidence of intent, she wouldn't be able to prove it in court. Officer Thompson caught up with her in the hallway. Detective, the DA called, says with the evidence we have, the best we can do is manslaughter in self-defense, and given the circumstances, she'll probably get probation. Martha nodded, not hiding her disappointment. Keep working the evidence. There must be something we've missed. She headed for the exit, but stopped when she spotted Alice in the lobby of the station. The young woman was standing at the window, looking out at the street. There was no trace of recent tears or fear on her face, just an expression of cold calculation. But when she caught Martha's gaze, her face instantly transformed back into the mask of a grief-stricken victim. Martha turned away, feeling the certainty building inside her. Alice Kane was not a victim of circumstance. She was a calculated killer who had used the situation to solve her financial problems. But proving that would be damn hard. The Riverview Police Department's ballistics lab greeted Detective Martha Reed with sterile cleanliness and the quiet hum of equipment. Examiner David Chen, a short man with a neatly trimmed beard, was waiting for her with a finished report. The results are unequivocal, he said, pointing to a monitor showing ballistic traces. The shot was fired from a collector's gun recovered from the crime scene. An antique model, but in perfect working order. Robert Kane seems to have taken meticulous care of it. What about the distance of the shot? Martha asked, scrutinizing the photographs. About 1.5 meters to 2 meters, Chen answered. No powder or burn marks on the victim's clothes, which rules out a contact shot. And one more detail. To fire this gun, you have to first cock the trigger, then pull the trigger. Those are two separate, deliberate actions. Martha nodded thoughtfully, another inconsistency in Alice's version of the accidental shot during the struggle. What about the prints on the gun? Alice Kane's prints are clear on the trigger and barrel. Chen flipped through the pages of the report. On the buttstock, both Alice's and Robert's prints are smudged. That could be consistent with a version of the struggle, but not necessarily. The smudged prints could have come from any contact with the weapon. What about DNA? There were trace amounts of skin under the victim's fingernails that matched Alice's DNA. That confirms close contact. We also found traces of DNA from both of them on the gun, epithelial cells, sweat. Biologically, it's consistent with self-defense. Martha felt slightly disappointed. The physical evidence supported Alice's story, although it didn't disprove premeditated murder. Thank you, David. She picked up the folder containing the report. If you find anything else, let me know. Next stop was the medical examiner's office. Dr. Harris, a tired-looking man with perpetually disheveled gray hair, was going over the toxicology results. Alcohol in the blood, but in moderate amounts, he reported. No traces of drugs or other substances. Death was instantaneous. Bullet went through the heart. Time of death confirms between 6 o'clock and 7 p.m. Anything unusual? Martha asked. There are no defensive wounds or bruises, Harris said thoughtfully. If he really attacked Alice, as she claims, I'd expect to see signs of resistance. Broken nails, scratches, bruises. There's none of that. And signs of sexual contact? Confirmed. Harris nodded. Traces of lipstick in the intimate area match the shade of lipstick found in Alice's purse. Sperm is present. I don't see any signs of coercion, but that doesn't rule out blackmail or psychological pressure." Martha thanked the expert and returned to her office, where she spread all the reports and crime scene photos on her desk. She slowly built up a chronology of events, matching Alice's testimony with the physical evidence. 6 hours and 30 minutes in the evening, Robert Kane invites Alice into his office. 6 hours and 45 minutes, a wire transfer in the amount of $280,000. Approximately 7 o'clock in the evening, a gunshot, Robert Kane's death. Only 15 to 20 minutes elapsed between the money transfer and the death. During that time, there was intimate contact then. According to Alice, Robert became aggressive, tore her dress, she grabbed the gun, they struggled, and the shot was fired. Martha shifted her gaze to the picture of the torn wedding dress. The tear at the shoulder looked too neat for a struggle. She picked up the textile expert's report. The pattern of damage to the fabric indicates a deliberate tear along a pre-made incision. There are no signs of jerking or stretching typical of violent injury to clothing. Another discrepancy. There was a knock on the door, and Officer Thompson peeked into the office. "Detective, the glove test results are in." He placed another folder on the desk. "I think you'll find it interesting." Martha quickly looked through the new report. During the search of Alice's wedding suite, white lace gloves that were part of the wedding outfit were found. There were traces of gunpowder and microscopic particles of the oil used to lubricate the collector's gun. If Alice's testimony is to be believed, she had long since removed the gloves by the time of the incident, Martha murmured. Those marks shouldn't have been there if she had spontaneously grabbed the gun in self-defense. The picture was slowly taking shape. Martha saw the outlines of the truth behind the scattered evidence, cold calculation instead of desperate self-defense. She pulled out her cell phone and dialed the number for the tech department. "This is Detective Reed. Any luck recovering the deleted messages from Robert Kane's cell phone?" "Partially," the technician answered. "Most of them were irretrievably lost, but we recovered a few fragments. I'll send them to you right away." A few minutes later, a report appeared on Martha's computer. Among the recovered data was a message sent by Robert Kane to an unknown contact 2 days before the wedding. "Verification complete. EF is hiding $280K worth of debt. Using this at the wedding. R." Martha leaned back in her chair, mulling over the new information. Robert was indeed planning blackmail, but the message said nothing about his intentions afterward. Was it simply a way to upset his son's wedding to an unwanted bride? Or did he have dirtier plans? There was no time to ponder. Alice Kane's preliminary hearing was starting in an hour. The county prosecutor, Amanda Phillips, was pushing for a charge of premeditated murder, but Martha knew that with the evidence available, that would be difficult to prove. The courthouse was unusually crowded. The case had attracted media attention, the murder of a prominent businessman on the day of his son's wedding, allegations of sexual assault, a young bride as a suspect, the perfect front-page story. Alice Kane sat next to her lawyer, an expensively dressed man with a shark-like smile. She looked flawless, a modest navy blue dress, minimal makeup, hair pulled back into a simple updo. The image of the innocent victim had been thought out to the smallest detail. James Kane sat a few rows behind her, his face expressing no emotion. He didn't look up when Alice turned to him before the proceedings began. Judge Morrison, a stern woman in her 60s, called the room to order. "Prosecutor, state the prosecution's case," she said. Amanda Phillips stood up, straightening the lapels of her austere jacket. "Your Honor, the state intends to file a charge of second-degree murder. The evidence indicates that Alice Kane used a blackmail situation to commit cold-blooded murder to get rid of debts and an unwanted witness." "Objection!" Alice's attorney immediately jumped in. "The prosecution is making unsubstantiated allegations without sufficient evidence." "I sustain the objection." The judge nodded. "Mr. Berger, present the defense's case." Alice's attorney moved smoothly to the center of the room. "Your Honor, my client was the victim of brutal blackmail and sexual assault by her father-in-law on the most important day of her life, when Robert Kane became violent after forcing her to become intimate. Mrs. Kane defended herself in the only way available. We ask that all charges be dismissed on the grounds of self-defense." The judge listened carefully to both sides, then turned to Martha, who was sitting in the front row. Detective Reed, have the police gathered enough evidence to charge you with second-degree murder? Martha stood up, feeling the gravity of the moment. Your Honor, the investigation has uncovered a number of inconsistencies in Mrs. Kane's testimony. Ballistics testing confirms that the shot was fired from a distance, which contradicts the gunfight theory. Traces of gunpowder were found on the suspect's gloves, although she said she had removed them long ago. The damage to the wedding dress bears the hallmarks of a deliberate act, not the result of an assault. Martha paused, looking into Alice's eyes. Not a muscle in the young woman's face quivered. However, Martha continued, we can't disprove self-defense with absolute certainty. The DNA traces are consistent with Mrs. Kane's testimony, and there is documentary evidence of blackmail by the victim. Judge Morrison tapped her pencil thoughtfully on the table. I have heard both sides of the case and reviewed the case file, she said after a pause. Under the totality of the circumstances, I see no probable cause for a charge of second-degree murder. However, the facts point to a possible exceeding of the limits of necessary self-defense. The case will go to trial with a charge of manslaughter. Amanda Phillips looked disappointed, but not surprised. Martha knew the prosecutor understood the weakness of the prosecution's case as well as she did. As to the measure of restraint, the judge continued, the defendant is released on $100,000 bail, with an undertaking not to leave the county and to appear at all court hearings. Alice nodded demurely, but Martha saw a slight smile flicker across her lips. 3 months later, the trial was held. The trial was short. The defense was based solely on self-defense after a sexual assault caused by blackmail. The prosecution tried to prove that Alice's actions were premeditated, but without direct evidence of intent, these arguments failed to convince the jury. On a rainy September day, the court reached a verdict. Guilty of manslaughter, in excess of necessary self-defense. Alice Kane was sentenced to 3 years probation with mandatory community service and psychological counseling. Martha watched Alice as she left the courtroom. No tears of relief, no trembling in her hands, just the calm confidence of someone who had gotten exactly what she'd hoped for. You did your best, Detective, Amanda Phillips said as she gathered her papers. Sometimes the system doesn't work the way it's supposed to. It's not about the system, Martha replied. It's just that we ran into someone who had planned this carefully and left no direct evidence. That evening, Martha sat in her office, finalizing the report on the Kane case. The case would be closed, the files would be filed away, and life would move on. But Martha couldn't shake the feeling of incompleteness, the feeling that justice had not been served. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Michael Green, business partner of the late Robert Kane, stood on the doorstep. May I? He asked. I wanted to thank you personally for your work on the case. Have a seat. Martha pointed to the chair across from him. I'm not sure I deserve a thank you, though. Alice Kane is practically free. And yet you tried. Michael smiled weakly. You know, I knew Robert for almost 20 years. He was a complicated man, often ruthless in business. But what this woman accused him of, that doesn't sound like him. What makes you so sure? Martha asked. Robert idolized his son, Michael replied. Everything he did, even his objections to the marriage, was out of concern for James. He would never cross that line. But we found evidence that he planned to use information about Alice's debts, Martha objected. Blackmail, perhaps. To upset the wedding, yes, Michael nodded. Robert thought Alice was deceiving his son and wanted to expose James. But sexual coercion? Never. Martha tapped her pen thoughtfully on the case file. Unfortunately, Mr. Green, we'll never know for sure what happened in that office. You're right, he rose. I just wanted you to know that not everyone believes this self-defense story. Some of us see the truth. After Michael left, Martha sat in the silence of her office for a long time. Then she resolutely put the case file away in her desk drawer. Officially, the case was closed, but in her mind it remained open like an open wound. 6 months later, Martha met Alice by chance in a city park. The former Mrs. Kane looked impeccable. Expensive clothes, well-groomed appearance, the confident gait of a woman without worries. She was walking down the alley in the company of an elegant middle-aged man, talking animatedly and laughing. Their gazes met, and for a split second Martha saw recognition in Alice's eyes. and then a flash of triumph. A slight smile tugged at her perfectly painted lips before she turned away and continued on her way, not letting on that she recognized the detective. Martha stared after her, remembering all the details of the case. Alice was free now, debt-free, with a light probation instead of jail time. The perfect crime, perfectly planned and executed. She pulled out her cell phone and made a quick note. Alice Kane, check new companion. Maybe this would go nowhere. Or maybe someday Alice would make a mistake again, and then Martha would be ready. 2 weeks later, Officer Thompson placed a fresh newspaper on Martha's desk. "Thought you might be interested," he said. A small notice on page 3 announced the divorce of James and Alice Kane. The reason given was irreconcilable differences. Under the terms of the divorce proceedings, Alice retained her recently purchased home, worth a little over $270,000. She got everything she wanted, Martha muttered. She got out of debt, got rid of an unwanted witness, and got away with it. Sometimes bad people win, Thompson said philosophically. Temporarily, Martha replied, folding the paper. Only temporarily. She went back to work on her new case, but her thoughts kept returning to Alice Kane. The case had been an important lesson to her about the thin line between truth and lies, between justice and its imitation. Martha realized that she had encountered a skilled manipulator who was able to use the system to her advantage. Alice had played the perfect victim, making everyone believe her version of events, even though the truth was very different. But Martha Reed was a patient person. She knew that people like Alice would sooner or later make a mistake, and when they did, she would be ready. In the meantime, all she had to do was accept that some promises were broken, some vows were broken, and justice didn't always prevail, at least not right away.